As I mentioned earlier, Reverend David is speaking in California, but we have a special treat also from California. So our guest speaker is Dr. Jim Lockard. He's a spiritual leader for the Center for Spiritual Living in Simi Valley, California, and he currently serves on the Centers for Spiritual Living Growth and Development Commission, as well as the CSL Disaster Relief Coordinator. A member of the Board of Directors of SOMARC, Inc., which is the holder of the intellectual property for the Centers of Spiritual Living. Dr. Jim is also on the Board of Advisors for the Association of Global New Thought, and he served on the International Centers for Spiritual Living Board of Directors from 2003 to 2012. Prior to his entry into ministry, he worked in law enforcement in both Maryland and Florida. As you can tell, this is not the man's first day at the rodeo. He is certainly qualified. Dr. Jim is a certified presenter in spiral dynamics and the SQ21 Spiritual Intelligence Assessment and Coaching Process. He and his wife, Dorianne, operate the ministerial coaching program, helping ministers fully realize their potential, and they lead spiritual travel groups to locations around the world. His book, Sacred Thinking, Awakening to Your Inner Power, is available in paperback and electronic editions and also in our lobby out front. And what an honor it is for not only Dr. Jim to talk at both services today, but he also is going to lead a workshop for us right after the second service at 1:30 entitled, What to Do When Prayer Treatment Doesn't Work. And this will be this afternoon again, 1:30 to 3:30, so you don't want to miss that either. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big SLCA welcome to Dr. Jim Lockard.
Wow, thank you so much. Welcome, or greetings from Simi Valley, California. Everybody says, where's Simi Valley? It's about a half-mile past reduced speed. So you can't miss it. We're just north, and believe it or not, we're west of Los Angeles, but we're not in the water. California kind of curves out. So we're right between LA and Santa Barbara. And we're the home of the Ronald Reagan Library. So we've got that going for us. But it's wonderful, wonderful to be here, and Dr. David and I are swapping states today, and I always love to go and speak at centers where I know the teacher is amazing, because I can make some assumptions that people will be kind of familiar with what we're going to talk about. I know there are also people here for the first time who have no idea what they've walked into, and we'll try to help make them comfortable as well. My topic today is creative suffering. Well, has anyone in here ever suffered for any reason about anything? Okay, so a few of you, okay. One of the great things about our teaching is that we incorporate an understanding of Western psychology. Western psychology really began right around the latter part of the 19th century, and you're familiar with some of the folks like Freud and Jung and William James and some of the others that helped to create that. And one of the benefits of having a spiritual tradition that came to be after that development was that we got to include it. Because one of the things you may notice about most religious traditions is they kind of cut off at the level of knowledge that the founder had. And after that, they kind of want to hold on to those worldviews, even though they may evolve, you know, like the idea that they evolve is not accepted by everyone. So we got to include, and Dr. Holmes certainly studied Western psychology, particularly the work of Carl Jung. And one of the things that psychological wisdom tells us is that suffering is optional. Difficulty is guaranteed, but suffering is optional. And the difference is that difficulty is something we encounter every day. It could be a broken shoelace, or you could go bankrupt, or something like that. But all those kinds of things, you know, the first noble truth of Buddhism is all life is difficult. But it's what we do with that difficulty that determines whether or not we suffer. And let me give you a little story. Imagine, if you will, a old white clapboard church in New England that seats about 100 people if it's packed. And it's a Sunday morning, and the minister is giving a fire and brimstone lecture, trying to encourage the members of the congregation to sin no more. And all of a sudden, behind the minister, this black cloud begins to arise out of the floor. And there's lightning in the cloud, and there's a smell of sulfur in the air. And arising out of that cloud, and the people are starting, their eyes are getting real big, and they're thinking, looking for the exit. And arising out of that cloud, unfolding, is Satan himself. And people are just running for the door, and he says, "Ha ha 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 ha, run, you fools, it's Satan." And they all go running. Even the minister looks back, and he's out the door. And Satan once again goes, "Ah ha 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 ha." And he looks down, and in about the second row, there's about an 80-year-old man just sitting there. And he says, "What's the matter with you, man? Don't you know who I am?" The little guy says, "Oh, I know you. Been married to your sister for 38 years." Now, the advantage of being married to Satan's sister is that you're not so afraid of Satan when he shows up. The advantage of going through difficult times is if you do it right, you become stronger. The world is less fearsome overall. When I was in law enforcement, I worked most of my career in Dade County, Florida, which is the county that includes Miami. During the Miami Vice years, if you remember that TV show. Little tidbit about the show, every uniform officer on that show was a real cop. They used to hire us to do that. And there was a year, it was 1992, and we had in January, we were all kind of concerned because in January of 1993, Miami was going to host the Super Bowl. And in February, the Pope was coming to visit. So that was going to involve us very extensively, as you can imagine, and there was a lot of concern in the department about preparation and getting ready for it, and we had started planning more than a year out. And on August 25th of 1992, a little storm called Hurricane Andrew came in off the Atlantic and pretty much wiped out the southern half of Dade County. 650 of our officers lost their homes, to give you some idea of the extent of it. And when you got down around Homestead, Florida at the time, there was no building taller than about 5 feet. Everything was gone. So we went on, that day, we went on, a couple days before that actually, we went on 12-hour shifts 7 days a week. And we stayed in that configuration from August 25th to December 31st. So it was kind of an interesting time. They needed to put a lot of resources into the southern part of the county. I got promoted, a bunch of us got promoted and sent down there. And I didn't live down there, I'd never worked down there, and there were no street signs. And I was on the night shift. And I was the squad lieutenant, which meant I was in charge of this whole district, and I couldn't leave the station because I'd get lost and they'd have to send people out to find me. So I played a lot of solitaire, as I recall. But it was a crazy time, and a lot of difficulty, a lot of suffering. A lot of families were out of their homes, and we were trying to relocate people. Officers showing up with like a uniform shirt because that's all they had, So we got through that, and then when January came, it was like, oh, the Super Bowl's in 4 weeks. Big deal. No problem. It was like, so what? After what we've been through, this is going to be like nothing. So the difficulty that we had, which we certainly didn't ask for, nor would we want to repeat, prepared us to look at the world in a new, more powerful way, a new, more empowered way, let's say. And that's really what this teaching is about. A lot of people, when they come into a New Thought teaching, of which we are part of the New Thought family, which basically says change your thinking, change your life, and that if you look at the world with the correct attitude, everything will fall into place. And there's some truth to that, but that's a little bit of a naive way to look at it. The reality is when you change your thinking, you do change your life. It doesn't mean life gets less difficult. It may get more difficult. But what does happen is you are capable now of calling forth from yourself what you need to master whatever it is that's in your life. To be an agent of transformative change in your own life and others. So that little fella sitting in the second row of that church, he knew what he was talking about. Oh yeah, Satan's a big, if you believe in Satan, that's a big deal, but it's not so far removed from what I already know. Everybody else had to run out because they couldn't confront what was in their lives. Now, there are a lot of universal principles of which science of mind is certainly an adherent to, you might say. Dr. Holmes was a great synthesizer. He wasn't a creator so much. The only thing he really created in the whole teaching is the practice that we call spiritual mind treatment, which is the steps to affirmative prayer. Everything else he took from existing ancient wisdom, and there's a wonderful book, I don't know if you have it in your bookstore or not, or in your library, but it's called The Perennial Philosophy by a fellow named Aldous Huxley. And it was written in about 1946. And Huxley looked at these traces of what he called universal principles, ancient wisdom, that arose in times of such great antiquity that they predate our understanding of human history. They come from before writing, before what we understand as civilization, which is only about 5,000 to 7,000 years old. There were civilizations before that, but none that we have written records of. But out of those ancient traditions, believed to be in what is now Egypt, came something that we now call the Hermetic philosophy, attributed to a mythical character named Hermes Trismegistus. And there were a number of basic universal principles that came forth that are part of the science of mind, that have been carried forth through all of the years, through the Gnostics, through the mystery schools in the West. And in the East, they became part of mainstream religion. In Hinduism and Taoism and Jainism and Shintoism and Buddhism, these principles became central. In the West, they became kind of underground. And he traces these throughout all the different, not all, but most of the different world traditions. And one of those principles is the universe cannot present you with anything that you are not already prepared to deal with. Now, I know there have been days when you haven't felt that way. When you probably said, how did this come into my life? When you were the one running out the back door of that little church, saying, get me away from here, all I want to do is disappear. But I would point out that you're still here. So whatever it was, you moved through it. Maybe not as gracefully as you would like to, but here you are. So when we're confronted with these kinds of challenging situations and circumstances, and that we all will be, loss is part of life. Suffering is optional. We either move through it and grow from it by allowing whatever that circumstance is to call forth from us what it came to call forth. And I believe that's really the way it works. Something comes into your life to call forth something from you that you have not yet revealed. I'm reminded of the wonderful lesson, I imagine he's talked about it here, Dr. David climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. He may have mentioned it. He gave a talk on that at our conference down in Orlando in February, and I was struck by that because it's a perfect iteration of this that I'm talking about, where, yeah, he volunteered, but he didn't really know what he was getting into. You know, we do that all the time, right? You ever get into a relationship and you didn't know what you were getting into? Thought you found Mr. Right and then later found that his name was Always, right? But So it doesn't have to be something that falls out of the sky and lands on you. It can be something that you went into thinking your eyes were wide open, and it wasn't the thing. But yet, when you find yourself in those circumstances, here's what I'd like you to remember, if not immediately, sometime in the first 20 minutes. This is in my life because I called it forth so that something unexpressed in me may be expressed. This is in my life because I called it forth so that something unexpressed in me may be expressed. A greater sense of love, a greater sense of kindness, a greater sense of strength, a greater sense of just realizing that I am, here's what it really boils down to. I am a fit for the world, and the world is a fit for me. You ever feel like you're out of place? That you didn't belong? That the world somehow would just as soon cast you aside? Yeah. That's a good way to suffer. Because you know it's not true. There may be some people that would prefer you didn't exist. You may be married to one of them, but... or you may have just cut one of them off in traffic, more likely. But in reality, the idea that we're not a good fit, that we don't belong, is such a false idea. And my point is, that's where most of our suffering comes from, accepting something that isn't so, as though it were. I'm not enough. I'm not good enough for the situation. I'm not strong enough. God or somebody has brought forth something into my life that is beyond me, that is impossible for me to deal with. Why me? Why me? Why me? A few years ago, another hurricane hit Florida. I don't know why they put Florida there. It's just they're always getting hurricanes. Although it may be going away soon, so that's another story. Another hurricane came through, and actually there were 4 storms that hit within about a month. 2 on the west coast and 2 on the east coast, and they kind of came in and went up the center part of the state, and about 6 of our centers were damaged pretty heavily. And I had been a co-pastor with Dr. Arlene Bump in Fort Lauderdale. I had since moved out to California right before the storms hit, and the Fort Lauderdale Center sustained about $750,000 damage to their building. And a lot of folks, had tremendous damage to their homes and so forth. And on our ministers' listserv, which is something that we get together, some ministers are on, and it's an email thing, and you can kind of say, does anybody remember this quote, or give me something to talk about Sunday, or something like that. Or what's the matter with my congregation anyway? Well, there were some people from Florida and some of the centers saying, why us? Why did this have to happen? And Dr. Arlene, who is ever clear, said it came to us because it was ours. It could be no other way. If it's in your life, it's yours, whether you think you called it forth or not. I love Joseph Campbell, the work of Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, and I actually created a course that we use in our curriculum based on his work. But one of the things he talks about in terms of spiritual maturity and spiritual growth is that you get to the point where you have to accept everything and reject nothing. He says the spiritual warrior says yes to everything. Whatever is in front of me must be mine. And the idea being that if it's in front of me and it's mine, it's there either because I am already able to master it, or this is my calling in this moment, is to learn to master whatever this is. And he says we spend so much energy trying to avoid what is ours, trying to keep the negative from happening. Everyday stuff. It doesn't have to be a big thing. It can be like, say, if you do drive the speed limit, why? Why do you do that? And many people will say, because I don't want to get a ticket. Okay? That's an example of practicing avoidance. And you're putting energy into a negative. You can't figure out why you ought to want to drive the speed limit. Because all these other people are getting there ahead of you. Maybe 2-3 car lengths ahead of you. You know, in the big picture, it's not that big a deal, right? You could have left 2 minutes earlier, but oh, well, you know. Why do you take the trash out of your house? People say, well, I don't want the house to smell or be dirty. That's practicing avoidance. Can't you figure out why you ought to want to love to take out the trash? Well, think about it. Yeah, because I live in a clean environment. I am worthy of a clean environment, and I do whatever's necessary to facilitate that. I drive the speed limit, let's say, because I choose not to be in fear of getting a ticket or anything else, and I choose to do what's safe because that's who I am. I do my spiritual practice every day, not because I have to, but because I choose to, because if it's a have to, you probably won't do it very long. See, there aren't any have-tos in this life, except one. We all owe the universe a physical death. It's on your agenda. My plan is to live forever. So far, so good. But I'm not encouraged when I look around me and see what happens, right? So we owe that. But everything else is a matter of choice. And I say, well, what about your taxes? You got to pay your taxes. Haven't you been reading the newspaper? You don't have to pay your taxes. Well, just don't send them in. Well, what if they catch me? I'll go to jail. Yeah. Listen. Do what you want, but we have to deal with the consequences of what we do. You know, you don't have to pay taxes. Don't work. Don't have any income. Well, gee, but I like living in a house and eating food. Then shut up and pay your taxes. I mean, really. I was teaching a class some years ago, and a woman was saying, she was in her 60s, and she was like, I want to start a business. That was her goal in the class. She was doing spiritual practice around it, and she was going to start, it was going to be like a transportation business for healthcare folks and so forth. This was back before that was really common. And she was working on it, and we were sharing. She would talk about how it was coming, and then one week she comes in and says, I'm just defeated. Her whole demeanor was like she was slouched over and sad. What's the matter? Well, I went to the county courthouse, and there's reams of paperwork to fill out, and there's all these regulations and all this stuff you have to do. And I said, yeah, and you don't want to do that, right? She goes, no, it's way too much. I said, I think everybody in the world agrees with you because there are no other businesses. She goes, what are you talking about? I said, well, if it's that hard, how could anybody start a business? Did you notice any businesses on the way here? Yeah, I said, well, you know what all of those people did? They went to the courthouse and they filled out the paperwork and they wrote the checks. See? And you've decided to make it a point of suffering because you feel that you're being singled out by the county or the state or the federal government for trying to do good in the world. I said, is that what it's really about, or is it because you're 65 and you think you can't do it? Then she went into a deeper slump. I said, that's okay, that slump we can get you out of. See, it's almost never the thing. It's the underlying stuff that we really believe that, and it usually has to do something to do with self-worth, something to do with am I worthy, something to do with am I good enough, something to do with do I deserve it. And we don't really, it's hard to look at that, so we make the surface issues really complex and difficult. That's how to creatively suffer. Ernest Holmes said, the greatest obstacle to mastery of the science of mind is a lack of self-honesty. A lack of self-honesty. And to be truly honest is to see yourself as magnificent beyond measure. Because you are. We have a little game we play at our center whenever someone says, I'm sorry, they bump into you or drop something. I'm sorry. I say, no, you're not. You're magnificent beyond measure. Don't affirm that you're sorry. Because words have power. Apologize as a person of strength. But don't say I'm sorry. You're not. It's a lie. And yet, when I say I'm sorry, and I really mean it because I really stepped on your toe, I internalize the imagery around sorry, and I accept it as my own. It's really interesting what our psychology does. So here's my suggestion. Whenever you find yourself in a situation where you can say, you know what, I'm suffering. Now suffering, again, is not the initial incident. It's what we do afterward. Okay? So if I stub my toe, I'm in pain for a while, I can suffer for weeks by telling people the story. So whenever you notice you're in that suffering mode, which is optional, I want you to pay attention to that and say, is this who I am? Or am I the person that learns from whatever the incident was, or whatever the circumstance was, or whatever the loss was, and sometimes they're big ones. Can I learn to call forth from myself, or allow that which is in myself to express, so that I can alleviate the need to suffer? Doesn't mean I won't be sad. See, sadness is pure. Suffering isn't. Suffering is always, let me out of this. Sadness is I'm genuinely grieving about something. Grieving is on your agenda too. That's another thing we have to do. We have to grieve the losses in our life so that we can move on. Dr. Roger Teal talks about the need to hospice what needs to go in your life and to midwife what is ready to be born into it. A lot of us are carrying around a few personal corpses of old slights, old betrayals, old wounds that we refuse to set down and move beyond. And that doesn't serve you, you magnificent being, and it doesn't serve anyone around you. We're so afraid we might forget our wounds. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we did? So when you suffer, suffer creatively. The universe will support you in moving through it much more quickly and much more productively. Thank you so much.